Welcome to Psych for Psychology, a Nystrom and Associates podcast. Our host, Brett Cushing, is a licensed marriage and family therapist at Nystrom. Each week, he talks about all things mental health and therapy with guests, and you get a chance to dive into specific psychology topics that help promote personal development and wellness. And now, your host, Brett.
Hello and welcome to another podcast edition of Psych for Psychology. I am looking forward to talking about today probably one of my favorite topics. I find this incredibly helpful. It's a new way of thinking for a new way of living. And if we can learn how to think differently, we will actually add a lot more quality to our lives. And the way in which I'm referring to is something I referred to often in previous podcasts, and that is a dialectical way of thinking. What in the world is dialectical? It's a big word. We're going to learn two big words today, dialectical versus dichotomous. Now, dichotomous, let me start there. Dichotomous is a way of thinking that is kind of natural for us. We tend to think in manners that are the least complex possible. Of course, right? That makes sense. So we tend to think in black or white, all or nothing, right or wrong. Notice the word or. And so it's either this or it's that. Either this person is trustworthy or this person is not. And so this is not only our natural way of speaking and talking and thinking, it is a manner in which we see throughout our culture too, right? We see in the political realm, you are either this or you are that. We see it even in our relationships. We see people at work. They're either nice or they're not. We categorize things very typically, very naturally in terms of either or. So we call that dichotomous. And again, it's very natural. It's actually what also leads to prejudice and racism and things like that. It's unfortunately our natural way of thinking because we tend to think in the way that is least complex, the most efficient way. So this is efficient for us, and it's not very effective for us, because what happens when we think in ways that are dichotomous, all or nothing, what happens to our emotions? They go up. They go way up. And so I have an intensification of my emotion, and then I have an inability to manage that intense emotion. No, there's nothing wrong with the emotion itself. It's just the intensity of that emotion. And so dichotomous thinking will have that effect, not just upon each of us individually, but we can see this collectively in our society, can't we? We see the negative effects of all or nothing thinking in our culture. People are with me or they are against me. And so we see this, and this is kind of what makes movies interesting. I like movies and television shows where you have at one point a villain, and this person is sort of painted as all bad, and then you have the other person who's all good. And I like movies and television series where you have that change, and the person who used to be the victim becomes the hero or the heroine. And so we have this tendency, though, to want to see people as the villain and this other person as the hero. Now, what happens when we get that changed around? We start to enter into dialectical thinking. I remember the movie Megamind with my kids. I watched it years ago with them, and you had the villain. I think it was maybe, I don't know if it was Pixar, but it was some animated movie by Megamind. And Megamind was this villain who turned into the hero at the end. I not only enjoy the appropriation of grace to change lives, I like a comeback story. And so I really enjoyed that. There's other TV shows I've enjoyed where it really highlights This dialectical thinking that someone, there is something that can be not so appealing, let's say, about a certain character, and there's still something redemptive in that person. Now, what we refer to this as in the field of psychology is dialectical thinking. It's a synthesis of the opposites. So a person, we can acknowledge that a person has some very unappealing characteristics, and that's the key word, and at the same time, there's a synthesis that this person has some really awesome characteristics too. Now, you might already be thinking about people in your life that are sort of categorized in your mind as okay or not okay, as good or as bad. And think about it for a moment. Think about people in your life who maybe you once saw in a negative light, but now maybe you've gotten to know them better and you see them in a more positive light. Now, take this a step further. Think about how you view yourself. How do we view ourselves? A lot of times we view ourselves in a dichotomous way of thinking, all or nothing. We can do lots of really good things, and then we blow it in one area, and we tend to throw ourselves away completely. We self-invalidate. We define ourselves through our own self-talk in ways that are all or nothing. I can't believe I screwed that up. I'm such a jerk. When will I ever get this right? And we only focus on the negative, and we throw away the positive. So we can do this with other people. We can do this within our own self-talk. We do this in whole categories of people as a culture as well. And the solution is a new way of thinking for a new way of living. And that is to think dialectically, having a synthesis of the opposites. For instance, there are things I don't do very well at all. I'm not very mechanical. So if I try to do things mechanically around the house, everybody holds their breath, and because things tend to get worse. I make things worse rather than better. And it can be very tempting for me to conclude about myself, like, I stink. What kind of man am I, and have all these negative all or nothing kind of thoughts going through my head, and fail to acknowledge that I've got a lot of really good things about me as well. We can do this with our partners because they upset us about something. There might be a chronic behavior that drives us nuts. And it's real easy to focus on that. In fact, I think that's what happens in relationships. We are drawn to our opposite in our relationship, and the studies are very clear that more often than not, people do marry their opposite. And I think it's because we're drawn to them right away because we notice intuitively, hey, they got these really cool attributes that balance me out. And we enjoy that for a couple years, but then we also notice there are things about them that aren't so appealing and aren't so attractive either. And so we think, well, yeah, that's okay. I can work on that. I can fix that. I can change that element within them. And then we're unable to change another person. And then we get frustrated. And then by year 7, I think personally that's where that 7-year itch comes from. It's we shift in our focus away from the positives that really drew us to this other person and focus almost exclusively on the negatives. So notice how we can start very dialectically, like, wow, this person's great. Look what they have. And we're drawn to it because it's what we don't have. It's a synthesis of the opposite of ourselves. But then we shift and we tend to move towards a more dichotomous view of this person, all or nothing. And what I find that is very helpful within relationships is whether it's a marriage or just a romantic relationship with parents and kids, at work, wherever, is where we can shift back again and intentionally focus on the synthesis that this person has very wonderful, admirable, respectable strengths, and they have some weaknesses too. So when we're talking about thinking differently so that we can live differently and add greater quality to our lives, it really stems from thinking more dialectically, right? I can have a relative who would do anything for me. I know the person would love me, but maybe the person never returns my calls, never responds to texts. That can drive me nuts. And that doesn't take away that this person is an awesome person. I might get frustrated, and I still love this person intensely. A lot of times we think that these intense emotions that we categorize as positive or negative, they just can't coexist, and yet they can. And that's what really we're talking about. So why is this important for us? Well, because notice what it does in relationships and what it can do for our relationship within ourselves. We can begin to see ourselves more accurately. So this isn't, for instance, just thinking positive thoughts, the Gary Smalley looking in the mirror, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and darn it, people like me. It's not just thinking positive thoughts, it's thinking accurate thoughts, truthful thoughts. Truth sets us free. And the truth is that, there's good things about me, and there are things that are not so good about me. And when I can embrace that in my relationship with myself, it allows me to have a more effective relationship with somebody else, because now I look to them to bring balance to my life. They can balance out where I'm not so effective, right? And notice that allows intimacy, because I move towards this person with interdependence upon this person, and that person towards me, because I balance this person out. So a really good reflection of the fullness of humanity is when we have a dialectical balance together, that we balance one another out. Now, what I've talked about is in many podcasts how we need to have a main dialectic. In what I do here at Nystrom is dialectical behavioral therapy. The main dialectic we stress and the main balance we try to remind our patients of and ourselves is the balance of acceptance and change. Acceptance and change. It's super important that we remember this in all relationships, with ourselves, with others, within our culture, because that's where ultimate change can happen. But it's by leading with a sense of validation and acceptance and having some corresponding change. But notice what happens in our lives is we tend to grow up and we interpret and we experience from the world a sense that you need to start with change in order to be acceptable. So we want this balance of both, and we need to start with acceptance and validation first. That's really what enables change. And so what can happen for us is we forget this. We forget when we get hurt. Maybe we've experienced trauma or chronic invalidation from other people, and this can really be difficult for us. And so we have to be very intentional about this and how we look at the world and how we look at other people, and especially that person in the mirror, where we begin with acceptance and we have change as well. And notice, if I just have acceptance towards myself and towards others, change doesn't necessarily happen if there's no focus on that. And if I have only change and no acceptance, there might be some short-term change, but it's out of obligation. And it leads to anxiety because there's this pressure to change. And maybe I do effectively change, but now there's all this pressure to maintain what I've changed as well. And so we want to have this balance, acceptance and change. And we always lead with acceptance first. To help us with this, we talk about in Marsha Linehan's workbook and in many of her books, there's this assumption or 4 main ideas about thinking more dialectically with a synthesis of both effective and non-effective, or what we might call as positive or not so positive. One of the main ideas, or one of the assumptions that we have, is that the universe is filled with opposing sides and opposite forces. That's very true, isn't it? When we think about that. Now, I'm not just referring to a galaxy far, far away where Star Wars happened and there's the dark side of the Force and then there's the Jedi. It's in our own galaxy. It's in our own backyard, right? There's light and there's darkness. Notice that. Seeming opposites that coexist together. There's down and there's up. There's positive charges and there's negative charges, right? And so think about that. Where do we notice opposites in our lives? They are everywhere and it's natural. And so we might have a reaction that's negative to the idea that opposites exist and then they have to be continually antithetical. They can't coexist. But no, they do all the time. And there's actually, even think about this, there are still elements of truth in opposing points of view. That I don't think we can stress enough to ourselves and remind each other, remind ourselves that this person who I want to tee up as offensive, as intolerant, as whatever we do to see this person as all negative, there are still elements of truth in someone else's opposing point of view. And furthermore, we can still validate that. We actually can. Truth is able to be validated no matter what, no matter who it is. What concerns me is I hear people in the political realm, for instance, and they hear somebody who might be of an opposing political viewpoint, and they hear the person, and it's clearly something that's valid and true that the person might say, but I hear people react, and they're critical just because the person is of the opposing viewpoint or the opposing political party. No, that's being dichotomous. This person is all good all the time, or this person is all bad all the time. Think of where we would be as a culture if we could still validate something about people who oppose us. Nobody is absent of redemptive aspects in their lives. So that is one of the main ideas of having a dialectical mindset, is that the universe is filled with opposing sides and opposite forces that are synthesized and coexist at the same time. Another idea is that everything is connected in some way. We are all connected. Consider this. Physically, I am connected with you right now. Okay, I'm not saying that for a warm fuzzy or anything like that, but it's true. I am sitting on a chair. My feet are on the floor. The floor is part of the building. The building's part of the ground. The ground connects to where you are and connects to wherever you're sitting right now. There is a connection, right? So we are all actually physically connected. Even when we consider the space, the air that is between us, there is still a connection there, right? Separation. I think it's Marsha Linehan who suggests that separation is really an illusion because we are still connected. We see this actually even in the realm of quantum physics. Matter eventually dissolves into emptiness. And some molecules, even in our bodies, can be found in the stars. So we are all connected, and we can lose sight of that when we think dichotomously, all or nothing. I don't want this other person in my life. There's nothing redemptive about them in my life. Now notice how we can do that with our own self-talk too. But yet we are still connected. I remember during World War I believe, there were Germans and the Allies fighting against each other at Christmas time, and then they naturally just stopped, and as the story goes, they all began singing Silent Night. What a powerful illustration of the dialectic, that even my enemy can still have something redemptive. There's still a connection there. I have a friend of mine who, great guy, he actually went to, I think it was Vietnam or Korea, and he had to go behind enemy lines, and He actually went on a mission to save some other American soldiers behind enemy lines, and he brought back an enemy combatant and carried that person because that person was wounded, and that person was actually thanking him and even kissing him as he was carrying him to save his life. The reason he was able to do that is because his uncle had told him before he went to war, he said, "Remember, Bill, remember God loves the enemy just the same." Notice that dialectical perspective and how that perspective, that new kind of mindset affected his behavior. Another thing we want to remember, not only is that the universe is filled with opposing sides and opposite forces, and that everything is connected in some way, but change is the only constant we can actually count on. So some changes are fast, so you get light that moves through space super fast, and some changes are slow. It's springtime here, and we're noticing very slowly plants are coming up, flowers are just starting to come up. It's really difficult to notice that, but it's inevitable, it's unstoppable, and it's very obvious to see. So change is happening. It's happening all the time. I really like this proverb. You cannot step in the same river twice. Think about that. You can't step in the same river twice. It really speaks to change. Change is a constant. We can't, step into a river twice because it's always changing. The water is different. The sediment is changed, right? Fish are in different places. It's always changing. And it's a great reminder that change is always occurring. And so our experience of meaning and truth changes and evolves over time as well. I remember I performed the wedding for my oldest son, and I kind of gave an unexpected illustration about change and how it's constant and inevitable. And I said to my son, Zach, and my daughter-in-law to be Casey, I said, "Yeah, Zach, many people don't realize that your mom has been married to 5 different men." And there was a gasp and silence for a moment. And then I concluded and said, "And all of those 5 men are me." And thank God, right? Because I have changed and I continually change. I look at the person I was when I was a little kiddo in grade school, junior high, high school, college, young adult today. I am changing all the time. And yet there's a constant within me at the same time. Notice that dialectic. I'm still the same person and I'm always changing. And so we want to embrace change. We want to embrace this. Now, the last thing is that we want to understand that change is transactional. So I affect my environment, and my environment affects me, right? There's an example we talk about in DBT where once there was a school teacher who had a student with a learning disability, and she figures out how to teach him effectively because she didn't know how to do that. And then he gains confidence in his ability to learn. Now, as he gains confidence in his ability to learn, she also gains insight into what works and what doesn't. So notice there's an interplay. We're all connected. We all change. We affect our environment, and our environment is always affecting us. So these are principles, if you will, of how to think differently, how to think more dialectically, things to embrace as we try to be more effective in our thinking, that the universe is filled with opposing sides and forces all the time. Everything is connected in some way. Change is the only constant, and change is transactional. So how do I think, and how do I act dialectically? How do I think differently so that I can live differently and avoid the pitfalls and the difficulties with thinking so dichotomously all or nothing, where I just want to dispose of people very quickly? Well, first is that we need to remember there is always more than one side to consider. We want to look for both sides, right? Now, we talked many months ago about confirmation bias. I really encourage you to go back and listen about confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is what is kind of our default towards dichotomous all or nothing thinking. We want to hold on to our beliefs. And so therefore, when we want to hold on to it, and this is the most effective and efficient way, not effective, but the most efficient way to think, confirmation bias is what kicks in, and it's sort of this filter that filters out any contrary evidence and only allows what is consistent with our existing beliefs. So to think more dialectically is to be more intentional and consider both sides of an issue. Okay? So we want to ask, what am I missing? We're upset with our kids, and they just don't seem to be hearing us. No matter what we tell them to stop, we might want to stop ourselves and ask, what am I missing here? Where's the kernel of truth in the other side? Think about that. Where is the kernel of truth in the other side? There is. There always is. So we want to ask ourselves, what am I missing? Where's the kernel of truth in the other side? In other words, we want to be remembering and looking for both sides of an argument. Furthermore, we want to move away from extremes. We move away from perfectionistic thinking too. That's all or nothing. That's dichotomous. We have a podcast on perfectionism, and I encourage you to go back and look for that one and listen to that, because that's all or nothing thinking too. We want to move away from extreme thinking, and so we got to be looking for it as well. We also want to balance opposites. We want to accept reality and also look, how can I change it? Sometimes we just want to change it so bad and so badly that we're not actually accepting reality. And we do have another podcast on radical acceptance, that we need to accept reality for the way it is. But yet reality blows sometimes, right? It's unfair. There's an injustice. And we feel that if I accept it, I'm approving of it. I'm condoning it. And that's not necessarily the case. It's important that we accept, right? We lead with acceptance, and we can work on change at the same time. So that helps us to balance opposites. In other words, what we're trying to do is make lemonade out of lemons, right? And we want to, this is a tough one for us, we want to embrace confusion. We want to move away from the land of what should be to the land of what is. I never used to like that phrase, well, it is what it is. I thought, what a nonsensical statement. But when I've grown to appreciate it, it's because I've realized when I can say it is what it is, I'm actually moving towards acceptance. And it doesn't mean I have to like it. It doesn't even mean I have to understand it. I can still embrace it and say, yeah, I don't know. But we move away from this tightly held belief of what life should be and accept that it is what it is. And we try not to judge reality. We try not to judge one another. We try not to judge ourselves. We embrace confusion, and we embrace the dialectical balance that both can coexist. So what can also help us is we can move towards playing devil's advocate. We can do kind of role playing, put ourselves in another person's position. We can use storytelling to make a situation more clear to us, right? We can also, another big heading for us to consider is be aware that we are connected. So I don't have to take my experience personally all the times. I also can know that my experience is universally experienced. We've all been hurt, for instance, and many of us profoundly hurt. Some of us have been traumatized, and we don't want to minimize the hurt or the pain or the trauma, and we also want to move towards that in a way. We want to move away from it, and we want to acknowledge it. Yes, I want to move away from this. And at the same time, I want to move towards this, that this is a universally experienced thing. Unfortunately, while this is hurtful, it's it's also normal. It does happen to people. So the next thing we want to do is embrace change. Now, I've talked a little bit about that. Change, it is happening, so we need to embrace it. It's difficult to accept. And as I said, a lot of times it's because we think we are approving of change. So as I'm getting older, I don't have as much hair as I used to. I don't have the energy I used to. I don't have a lot of things I used to have. And that's life, right? That's what we say. Life is change. And so what happens when we don't accept change? In other words, think about it this way. We don't have any control over the inevitable change that is occurring in us and around us. And what happens when you and I try to control someone or something that is out of our control? It ends up controlling us. I'll say that again. What happens when you and I try to control things that are out of our control or people that are out of our control? Those things or those people end up controlling us. We get controlled by it. And so that's why we need to embrace change. Hopefully you can see that as we think differently, we can live differently. Many of us are always trying and working so hard at improving our lives, our relationships, our work, etc. And one of the most effective ways to do that is to think differently, to think dialectically, having a synthesis of the apparent opposites all around me and have a balanced perspective dialectically. My hope is that you're able to do that, that I'm able to do it. I can tell you it has freed me up in so many areas. It's brought greater peace and enhanced quality in my life. And I hope that you will experience the same. Thanks again for joining us today on Psych for Psychology. We'll look forward to talking again soon.
Thank you as always for listening, and please be sure to leave us a review. While this podcast can't be a replacement for therapy, we hope you enjoyed our discussion today and join us again next time. Nystrom & Associates is always available to those who are struggling. If you find yourself in need of support and help, please check us out at nystromcounseling.com.